Hello, everybody. We are playing with our sound, so if there's an echo, I may have to move from where I am. But welcome to the July 8th, 2020 Community Equity Action Team meeting. I am excited to see current seat members here, potential seat members here, and some of our former members maybe chiming in. I wanted to introduce the panel that you're going to have before you and talk about the format tonight. So tonight we have the first hour will be an open format, and there are other members of the public that are chiming in today to observe. This meeting is a priority for our seat members. These are people who have joined our committee, worked to build a relationship with us, and have taken on the task of representing commonly underrepresented voices. So if you are a seat member and you haven't sent us your questions already, you are welcome to type in your questions to the chat box and we'll be monitoring them. If you're not signed in under a name, can you please write seat with your question so we can prioritize your questions? We will be getting other questions from the public and we might not know who is who. So if you say seat member or your name, that makes sure we know who you are and we can elevate your questions as part of this conversation. So this dialogue will happen from 6 to 7 p.m. At 7 p.m., we're going to move to the seat only meeting. And so that is an additional link and that'll be a little bit different format where everyone can speak freely. So I don't want to waste our time because a lot of you have some excellent questions and I have a panel in front of you who wants to answer those. So I'm going to start by introducing who I have in the room. So I have Natalie D'Amico. She's currently a patrol officer and I think, can you turn your camera on, Natalie? Natalie has 11 years with us. She was a detective for many years and won some amazing awards for some of her casework. She's currently back on patrol and is one of our field training officers. Sitting next to her is communications specialist Sasha Lien. Sasha is one of our dispatchers and she helps train our new hires as well too. So she's one of our senior dispatchers upstairs. Coming to us on the offsite is Detective Aaliyah Slade. Aaliyah is a lateral police officer, which means she started her career in another state on the East Coast and has come to us. And I can't remember how many years you've been here already. She is senior officer. She was one of the senior officers on patrol, field training officer, and is now one of in our investigations division. She also has worked with our union and has some knowledge on how union representation works. You may have recognized Aaliyah. She's come to some of our seat meetings before, in addition to Sasha. I also have Officer Kevin Kaptur. Officer Kaptur has 13 years on. He is a U.S. Army veteran and a field training officer and has spent the last 5 years as a school resource officer at Rose Hill Middle School. So thank you for that. As the SRO sergeant, I'm grateful for Kevin's work. And then we have Chief Darryl Lowe. Chief was with Santa Monica Police for over 25 years, 26 years, I think, if I'm getting it right. He's been the chief here since, I think, October of 2019. He has recently been appointed to the governor's task force on policing for the state of Washington and also was recently appointed to the Washington Association of Sheriffs and Police Chiefs Executive Board. He carries with him his experience from California and then his time with us here. And then facilitating tonight is Shannon Kelly Ray. If you're a city employee, you know Shannon because she has taught extensive training for our city employees, and for the seat members, you know Shannon because she's our meeting facilitator. So with that, I'm going to try to turn it over to Shannon and see if we can start moving through some of the questions. Maybe. Okay, so what I'm going to do instead is jump to the chief and start with some of the questions that we got ahead of time. So Chief Lowe, if you don't mind talking to us, what is our vision and philosophy for policing?
Well, good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us for this important conversation. For our seat members, thank you for joining us in this post-COVID time. I know we missed our January meeting, so miss seeing all your faces, but again, thank you for being here with us tonight. So I'll start with the philosophy of policing here in the Redmond Police Department. So we serve the community as problem solvers, not merely as enforcers of the law, and I think that's very important. That we partner with the community to address the issues, not just put people in jail, because community policing and what the organization stands for is more than just that. But more importantly, we work in partnership with our community to build trust and to maintain legitimacy. And I think that that's critically important, especially in the current times that we face. We maintain that legitimacy through fairness in our processes, through transparency in our actions, and impartial decision making. But most importantly, and what we have, as an example of that here tonight, is that we're open to hearing the community's voices. The community has a lot of questions about, how we police, what we do, why we do it. We want to hear those questions. We want to answer those questions because, again, this is about a partnership with the community. So that's how we go about it from a philosophical perspective, from a vision perspective. So as your police chief, my vision is to make the Redmond Police Department the standard and the benchmark for other departments to follow. It's by making sure that we have the best practices, that we engage our community, as I said, as partners with the community, and that we put in place the training and programs so that we can be that benchmark for others to follow.
So this is Julie again. I have echo, so let me try to leave the room and ask the next question. And thank you everybody for your patience. All right, hopefully this takes away the echo a little bit. So Chief, this one is for you as well too. And then I would like anyone else to chime in as well. How is the optimal police culture defined, created, and maintained? So you talked about what your vision is for us. How do you make that happen, Chief?
So I believe culture is created from the top. So it's very important that everyone in the organization has a very clear understanding of what is expected of them. Going back to that philosophy, going back to the culture that we want to emulate as a police department. And then it's very important for myself as a chief, for my command team, to make sure that we hold the organization accountable to those standards, and that we do that fairly and impartially across the board. It's not one set of rules for executives and administrators, another set of rules for line level and support staff. That as an organization, that we have clear and unequivocal standards, goals, and processes, and that we all are held accountable to them moving forward.
All right, this next question I'm going to push over to Officer D'Amico. We had a question: how does Redmond Police Department's mental health professional, MHP, work with officers, and what is her role when called to assist with crisis intervention?
I'm one of the officers that gets to have our MHP, Susie Kroll, ride with us, or ride with me, and she can ride with me for an entire shift, for example, and come with me to a variety of calls. And other times she may only be able to jump in when we're responding to a call when somebody is in a crisis. We work together as a co-responder model, and I rely on her and she relies on me. So she is a trained MHP, although we do have some training with regard to people going through a crisis. It is nowhere near the level of training and education that she has. So to have her there is so beneficial for me as an officer when somebody is in a crisis. And I can sometimes step back and let her speak with that individual, because sometimes a person going through a situation like that does not want to talk to an officer. And I completely understand that and rely on Susie and her expertise to take over that role, and vice versa. We work really well together, and it's been an incredible experience to have her working with us, and I really hope that that can continue.
All right, I'm out of the room, so I'm not sure if Shannon was ready to take over questions again. So I will ask the next one. And if Detective Slade, I was hoping that you could help us answer this one. And it is: how is misconduct handled in the Redmond Police Department?
So as far as officers or any employee within the department was witnessing what they believe to be misconduct, everyone's expected to intervene if possible, and also to report it to a supervisor. That's expected of everyone. Um, Once a supervisor is notified, it will go up the chain, and the employee who is suspected of doing the misconduct will be questioned. So whether that's, depending on the severity, it may be an informal interview by a higher level supervisor, or it may be a formal internal investigation. And when there is an allegation, members of the department who are part of a union, they are they do have the right to have a union rep with them if there is a chance that the allegation could result in some type of punishment. And the role of a union can be varied. Sometimes it's just a matter of having a person there to facilitate a conversation between the accused and the supervisor who's asking them about what happened. You know, we don't assume that every allegation is true, but that's the whole purpose of the inquiry, is to find out if there was just a misunderstanding by the witness, or if there is a serious, or if the misconduct did happen. So with the presence of a union rep, could be there just to facilitate a conversation about what happened and what the employee could do better in the future, or to provide advice for the employee if they did in fact do something wrong, and how they are either going to remedy it by being instructed to receive further training, and or a combination of some type of punishment, and how to assist the employee in fulfilling that punishment or the training. So it's kind of difficult to answer that because the range of scenarios are great, but that's pretty much the gist of it.
All right. Is there anyone else that wants to add to that? Chief Lowe, did you want to add anything to that?
No, I would just say that, as I said before, you know, processes need to be fair and consistent across the board. You know, an employee, just like anyone else, there's a presumption of innocence, you know, until proven otherwise. And at the end of the day, it's about getting to the bottom of whatever that particular allegation is. And as Detective Slade, I'll say, correctly pointed out, you know, it's not always about discipline necessarily. Sometimes it could just be some remediation in the training, and how they applied a particular process or technique, and just making sure that the employee understands what the expectations are, both from the organization and from the community.
Thank you. And I'm going to turn it back over to Shannon. She's up and running to start facilitating from this point out. Maybe not. All right, I will do one more question until we know Shannon's up and running. So this is a follow-up question that we got. Is there independent oversight of the Redmond Police Department? And Chief, can you answer that?
Yeah, so presently there is not a like police review board or civilian review board for the Redmond Police Department. That's just the short answer. No, there is not one present. I'm not aware of any conversations around that. I'll say locally. I know in the both national conversation and regional conversation, there has been some mention of you know, possible oversight, but presently none exists here in Redmond.
All right. I'm going to jump to one of our published questions that we just came in from an applicant to seat. And that is, it's kind of a multi-part question. So I will share this with whomever can answer. What is the role and responsibility of the Redmond Police Department in the context of Seattle's regional policing, both as a department working with other organizations and as individual officers? He says, I am thinking specifically of joint efforts like Seattle's recent protests.
Okay, so as it relates to mutual aid, police departments, much like fire departments, support one another, in our efforts. As far as there's no obligation per se. I would say it's more of a professional courtesy, no different than some of the protests that we had here in Redmond. We received support from both Kirkland and Bellevue. So typically how that works out, if a jurisdiction realizes that there is a need for additional support, they will reach out to regional partners, identify what the task or event is, and then they will ask for a commitment from allied or partner agencies, and then those resources are sent to that particular jurisdiction and then deployed for the particular event in question.
And I'm monitoring the chat to see if there's any follow-up related to that question. Not yet. The next question is for communications specialist Leanne. If you could answer, what steps do dispatchers and officers take when someone calls 911 because someone looks suspicious?
So the main focus we have is getting the caller to articulate what exactly it is they're seeing that is causing them concern. So if they're not able to specify anything in particular that they think is suspicious, and we do hear this sometimes, they just don't look like they're from around here, or I haven't seen them here before, we will still put that information out for the officers, because the role we have as dispatchers in that discretion doesn't extend to not documenting the information at all, but the officers responding or the sergeant who's overseeing that patrol squad can make the determination of there is something articulated here that requires us to respond and make sure that everything's okay, or this can just be an informational call and it's gonna go away without any response, excuse me, because there's absolutely nothing of note in this call except a normal citizen going about their day.
I can add on that too, just from my perspective on patrol and receiving calls of that nature. I know I speak for probably a lot of us, but when we do get a call like that, dispatch is very good about asking more questions to get as much as possible. But if it is put out to us and there's not a lot of information at all about something being suspicious, if the call is not canceled by a sergeant, we typically ask more questions to find out more information ourselves, because we don't need to show up for something like that unless there's more that can be articulated that would require a police response.
So, Chief, we have a question for you. Can you hear me? Chief, we have a question for you.
Yes.
How does the Redmond Police Department's policies line up with the 6 pillars of the 21st Century Police Task Force that was created under the Obama administration in 2015?
So the Redmond Police Department is a WASPIC accredited department. So every 2 years, our policies, procedures are reviewed by a state accrediting agency. We line up very well, both with the 21st century pillars and also the Obama Foundation Mayor's Pledge, which Mayor Bernie just signed on to today, as a matter of fact. So specifically in those 6 pillars, when it speaks to building trust and legitimacy with your community, the SEAT group is a great example of that. This group was formed back in 2018 through, I'll say, much effort and energy. Thank you to Sergeant Beard for spearheading it. Thank you to Shannon for being our facilitator for this particular group since its outset. And that's a good example of, I'll say, I won't call it cutting edge, but just the progressiveness and the professionalism of this police department, because this group was created not in a time of crisis, but because it was the appropriate thing to do for this community and for this organization. When it comes down to the other pillar of policy and oversight, and as I said, in conjunction with the Obama Foundation pledge, we constantly review our policies and procedures. As a new police chief, that was one of the first things I did when I got here, was to look at our policies and procedures, go through that cover to cover to make sure that they represented the best practices for law enforcement. And we are currently right now evaluating a transition to a policy system known as a Lexipol, because that, as best we can tell based upon our research, based upon a number of other agencies, not just here in the state of Washington, but a number of police departments across the country utilize that policy system because of its value to them. One of the other things that we did back in 2014, as it relates to policy, to oversight and accountability, we implemented an early warning system in a system known as IA Pro, or Internal Affairs Pro. It's a system that allows information on officer conduct and or misconduct complaints, etc., use of force to be put into a database and establish an early warning system, such that if an officer has a problem, or if there's things that come up, we're able to get ahead of it before it becomes a viral video or a national news story. In the aspect of the community policing and crime reduction. Back in 2018, the city of Redmond, in conjunction with the court system, came up with the community court program, which is a model program that looks to reduce incarceration rates and get to the heart of the problem for a lot of our nonviolent crime, which oftentimes are mental health or substance abuse issues. As was mentioned in the earlier question, our MHP program, that was a program that we've been a part of that initially was grant funded by WASPIC. Seeing the value of that program, I initiated a process whereby we had an officer retire at the end part of last year. I utilized the funds from that open position and transferred that to the mental health provider position because it is such a valuable resource and tool for our particular officers. So we are right now in the process of finishing up that particular recruitment process. And in early August, we will have a full-time mental health professional here at the Redmond Police Department. We were successful in applying for and receiving that same grant funding. So that will allow me to expand that program even further. So we'll have the full-time mental health professional, but then we'll also be able to bring in an additional mental health professional part-time to make sure that we have even more coverage in that particular area. One of the other programs that we implemented under the I'll say under that pillar, the community policing aspect, is our Narcan program. And just a couple of days ago, one of our officers actually saved the life of a resident who's experiencing an overdose. And with that program, it's not about the fact that the person was under the influence of a narcotic. It was about the fact that the person was overdosing, and we were able to use this to in fact save her life. So these are some of the examples that the Redmond Police Department has done, over the years to I'll say both be in compliance with those particular pillars, but that is the type of organization, that we are here in Redmond.
That's great, Chief. And, we would be remiss if we, don't deal with what is essentially the elephant in the room. And, you can't, walk down the street in your community even with a mask. You cannot watch television today or look at your social media and not see, the current social climate, racial climate where it relates to police officers in light of the death recently of George Floyd in Minnesota and many others in other parts of the country. And so, the question that people, want to ask is, specific to the Redmond Police Department's policy on chokeholds or LVNR or use of force or no-knock warrants, flashbangs, use of CS or tear gas, what does the Redmond Police Department policy look like in terms of utilization of those as means to either subdue, control a situation, control someone in the community? What specifically is the policy on use of force at flashbangs, no-knocks, and those sorts of things?
Great. I left out one critical part in the 6 pillars. One of the critical aspects of that is that we also have a very robust peer support program so that we can take care of our people internally as well as far as the officer wellness. So I want to make sure I did not leave or did not recognize that group, because we have an incredible group of individuals within the department that are part of that program for our peer support. Specifically to our use of force policy. Presently, yes, the Redmond Police Department does have the LVNR policy, LVNR as part of the policy. One of the things I would like to take the opportunity to do is just make a clarification. Oftentimes when this subject comes up, the term chokehold is used. Chokeholds have been banned in police work since the 1980s. So there's no police department that actually has a chokehold that is part of a use of force policy. One of the other clarifications then it goes around to a stranglehold, which at that point the LVNR does, I guess, kind of fit more into that particular circumstance. So
can you give us, and so LVNR is an acronym. Can you?
Yes.
Yeah. Can you tell people what that stands for?
Lateral vascular neck restraint. Also known as a carotid hold. If you're a fan of MMA, or I'll date myself here, if you go back to the original WWE wrestling, Roddy Piper with the sleeper hold, all those are examples of what that particular thing is, and it's where pressure is applied to the sides of the neck to the carotid artery, which causes oxygenated blood, or restricts the flow of oxygenated blood to the brain and causes the person to pass out temporarily. So that is the breakdown of the acronym and what the actual technique is and does. When this conversation started, I met with our defensive tactics folks, some of our union representatives, to talk about the LVNR, the lateral vascular neck restraint, here within the Redmond Police Department. We have not used it here for the last 6 years. In this particular circumstance, we looked at it and we are in the process now of elevating it to a deadly force option only. Right now, it would be what would be considered a medium range option for a use of force, but understanding the sensitivity around it, we are in the process, like I said, of elevating it to that. It can only be used in a deadly force circumstance or situation, and to put it rather candidly, it would be akin to if the officer could utilize their firearm as a means of deadly force, then they could utilize the LVNR in the appropriate circumstance. As it relates to no-knock warrants, just like any search warrant, that is something that has to be applied for and signed off on or approved by a judge. Typically, no-knock warrants are used in high-risk circumstances when officers are going after violent criminals and/or oftentimes in drug circumstances. And that was the case that brought this idea or concept of no-knock warrants to the forefront. That is not something that is typically sought after from police departments, and it's incredibly hard to come by because it takes the justification for why that is really necessary, and then ultimately a judge has to sign off and approve it. So if the question is, does the Redmond Police Department seek no-knock warrants? I can say in my time here, we have not, and that is not a typical type of warrant that we would seek. As it relates to CS, tear gas, flashbangs, etc. That too came to the forefront as a result of the various protests that occurred across the country. Those are techniques that can be used in crowd control situations. However, typically tear gas or CS and flashbangs are typically used by SWAT teams or tactical teams when they are either making entry into a location or when a subject is barricaded in a location in an effort to get that person out safely. So that is not a standard practice within the Redmond Police Department. The Redmond Police Department, we don't have a supply of flashbangs or tear gas. We do participate in a regional SWAT team, and those tools are something that the SWAT operators have, not the normal patrol officer.
Thank you. So I want to transition that question. So Randolph, one of our seat applicants, asked a question specifically to the Seattle region, the Puget Sound region's, approach to policing. So when we think about Redmond as part of a broader community that works collaboratively with other departments, even with SWAT teams, what is the role, Chief, and responsibility of the Redmond Police Department in the context of different Seattle regions policing? So both as a department working with other organizations and even individual officers, what does that look like in terms of collaboration and policing participation, where maybe there is inconsistency between departments and their approach in terms of use of force?
So with that, I'll say it's complicated in some senses, but in other senses it's not. And the best analogy I can use is when the Redmond Police Department goes to another jurisdiction. So when we go to Bellevue, when we go to Seattle, that is Seattle's jurisdiction, and they ultimately have responsibility for law enforcement services there. Our personnel are there as additional resources. The individual police officers, or let me backtrack, the decision for the use of force, the decision for flashbangs, tear gas, those types of things are made by the incident commander of the jurisdiction in which it occurs. I'll call it the home team, right? So if you're on Seattle's turf proper, that would be Seattle's incident commander's decision whether or not to utilize those particular devices. And then those devices are typically deployed by the home agency. Now, an individual police officer, a Redmond police officer, a Bellevue police officer that is there in Seattle, if they feel threatened or if they're confronted with a situation, as an individual officer, they have the ability and the right to protect and defend themselves, to say utilize pepper spray, etc. The question came up when we had our officers in Seattle back on the 30th in support of the protests. Did we use tear gas, flashbangs, rubber bullets, etc. On the crowd? We did not. Again, that is the jurisdiction of Seattle. Nor did we in Bellevue when we were there the following day, or in Kirkland the following day. We did have 2 uses of force when we were in those other jurisdictions, and it was pepper spray on both of those particular occasions. So from a regional perspective, it's a collaborative agreement between the police departments and or the police chiefs, but the individual officer will always have a right to defend and protect themselves, regardless if they're in Redmond, Seattle, Bellevue, etc.
But essentially, when they're in the field and they're collaborating with other officers or other departments, the default is to practice in a manner that's consistent with their own department. And then the backdrop is that they have the right to be able to protect themselves.
Correct. So the Redmond police officers that were deployed to these other jurisdictions follow the policies and procedures of the Redmond Police Department. So when they came back to home base, they completed all of the appropriate use of force paperwork as they would had that event occurred here in the city of Redmond. I went through the same review processes by the immediate supervisor, by the lieutenant, by the captain, and by myself. So the same policies and procedures apply irrespective of where they're at.
Okay. And so and this is a question from Rebecca Moore. So given that, are Redmond Police Department's policies and procedures available to the public for review? Are they able to look and understand and learn exactly what those policies and procedures are so that they can understand the standards and metrics under which officers and the department operate?
Yes, they are. If they go to our website under our FAQ or frequently asked questions, copies of our use of force policy are published there. We are in the process, as I said, of evaluating and transitioning to a different policy system, irrespective of if we stay with the current one or if we transition to a new one. The entirety of our policy manual will be made available moving forward.
And how is use of force by a Redmond police officer investigated? So should you invite the public to the frequently asked questions page. So, when you arm the community with information, all of a sudden you have people that will have cameras or will be visible and will watch. And, I'm sure, and I'm sure that you are chief as well, confident in the behaviors and the conduct that officers would conduct themselves. But should someone, determine or whether it's the public or the department or anyone, should an officer be found on the other side or be questioned regarding use of force, how is use of force by a Redmond officer even investigated?
So if a Redmond police officer utilizes force, they are required by policy to document that force. If that force results in injury to the suspect, they are required by policy and by law to immediately provide aid for the person upon whom that force was used. Once that force is reported, it is reviewed by a supervisor to make sure that it was both reasonable and appropriate for the circumstance, that it complied with policy. At that point, it will then be reviewed by a manager or a lieutenant to make sure that, again, that it was both reasonable and necessary and appropriate for the circumstance. If both of those levels, the supervisor and the manager, agree that it was reasonable and appropriate, it would be considered an appropriate use of force. It would then be elevated. It would come to the division captain. In this case, if it was a patrol officer, it would go to the operations captain, who would review it. Same thing to see if they concur, if there were questions about it, if there are additional details that would be necessary, it would be sent back, for those particular clarifications. And then ultimately it comes to me as the police chief, and I too review it to make sure that it was reasonable and necessary given the circumstances. And then ultimately I too can say, disagree or send it back for additional clarification or review. And if at any one of those steps, it was felt that the force that was used was not reasonable or not necessary, then the appropriate steps would be taken as explained by Detective Slade. And it could just be a conversation with the officer to make sure we have a clear understanding of what the officer's perception was of that particular circumstance. And then if necessary, a consult with our defensive tactics instructors to perhaps revisit the technique or application of that force to make sure that the officer is using the appropriate standards and using the techniques appropriately. And then if that use of force was determined to be, I'll say, unreasonable or out of policy, then the employee will be subject to the disciplinary process, which could be anything from remedial training all the way up to and including some type of suspension, and in an absolute worst case, If it was deemed to be unlawful, then that information would be presented to a prosecutor for consideration of filing charges. And I would just have to say this. Excessive force is never acceptable. There is no option for excessive force, but also I have to be clear. Just because an officer uses force does not make it excessive. And there is no such thing as a pretty use of force. Just by nature, any time force is used upon another person, it's going to look horrific. So the officer has to be decisive, be quick, and I'll say get it done and get it over with. It's not a knockdown, drag out. It's not, a circumstance where the officer is trying to inflict punishment. The officer is trying to overcome resistance or assault by a suspect to take that person into custody as safely and as reasonably as possible.
Shannon, if you don't mind, I was hoping Officer D'Amico or Officer Kaptur, both as field training officers and on patrol, could quickly go over what they report in their use of force report. So just some of the down and dirty, what they're putting down every time they use an incident of force.
Oh, yeah. So let's do that, and I think that's a good segue. So, the thing that brings people out, the thing that excites passion is when everyday members of the community see officers demonstrating use of force, having to engage in a use of force. Those are the images that are caught on camera phones, and those are the images that become viral. And so I want for, and they can jump in either or, but what we want to have them answer is, what are some of the things that happens? What does that judgment look like? What are some of the things that you've seen, and how do you approach this so that you can serve quickly, you can serve effectively, and make sure that you aren't at risk and the public isn't at risk?
All right, so I could start out, and then Natalie, you could feel free to jump in. So your use of force report, what you're detailing and what you're putting into that use of force report is pretty much your environment as the use of force happened. How many people were out there, how many officers were with you, what was the environment? Is it dark? Is it daytime? Are you alone? Other factors, was the subject belligerent or under the influence of drugs or alcohol? And also, perhaps their size is a big factor as well, that you're all detailing this in your report that caused you or led you to use that force necessary. So
I can kind of add on to that as well. I know one thing Officer Kaptur mentioned was size, and I know you can't all see me, but I'm 5 feet tall, and so I'm a little vertically challenged, if you will. Sometimes on calls when I'm by myself, that's definitely a factor that I need to consider. So ideally, there's more than one of us present. And I think sometimes to people not knowing what's going on, more officers can look worse when you're standing around maybe one person. But I look at it the other way, in that the more of us that are there, the less chance that more force would be used. Because if I'm by myself, force could be more, I guess, it could be a higher use of force if I'm by myself than if there were several other people there. And let's just go back to before having to use any force. I think that I never want to show up to work to have to use any force at all. I hope to get everything done calmly, and I think most of us do. So I do think that using verbal skills and other de-escalation techniques first, and being patient is always our ideal outcome. However, there have been times, unfortunately, where we may be just standing somewhere or approaching somebody without being able to even engage in a conversation, and somebody may be physical with us from the very beginning. And so it makes it really difficult to try and go back at that time and speak to somebody about what we would like them to do.
Okay, I want to ask another question for
I want to ask Kevin and Natalie another question. So, you talk about what it's like in the field and the description of the conditions. What kind of de-escalation training do officers receive?
So in the law enforcement academy, you take a 40-hour crisis intervention training, which covers a lot of the de-escalation. And we also, every year we do a 2-hour recertification with de-escalation.
And Natalie, did you want to add anything to that? So there's de-escalation, there's certification. Are there times that officers are able to talk with one another and share experiences in order to learn and kind of reevaluate situations so that they learn and grow? What do those conversations look like?
It's definitely, and I think that starts at, in field training when you're a brand new officer, and really teaching somebody some of these skills and modeling that for them. So having a brand new officer in the first couple of weeks, a lot of us officers that are training are showing them what to do versus having them go out and do it by themselves, so that we can model for them how to be and explain to them why we're doing what we're doing and allowing them to ask questions. And I think that's really important because you're learning that from the very beginning then versus starting a career out in a different environment, in a different culture, and then having to, after 10 years, learn a whole new way of policing. So if you can start teaching them these things from the very beginning, fresh out of the academy, then this is the basic foundation of what they're learning moving forward in their career.
Thank you so much.
And I'll just say real quick, I'm sorry, Shannon.
Oh, go ahead.
Go ahead. Yeah, what Natalie said is really important. And I know we have great field training officers here in Redmond, but just creating that basis of, instead of using force, hey, what can we do to de-escalate that situation is really important. So, and they build that foundation in the field training program. So.
Let me dig in a little bit deeper there. So go ahead, because I was going to have you share with us some of the examples of that.
Oh, sorry. I just wanted to.
I have a great example from today.
A lot of times, so we're talking about like de-escalating the people that we're engaging with in the community, but also part of that is kind of de-escalating ourselves, because an officer might have to go to another call right after that, after engaging physically with somebody. And not only is there a chance of the person getting injured, but there's a chance of the officer getting injured, but then having to emotionally calm down and help someone else on another call. And part of that is takes place informally, where people on the squad, we check in with each other, make sure that we're good to keep going for the rest of the shift. And then also we do have, like Chief mentioned earlier, peer support, where we have people that are trained to offer that emotional support to our fellow officers and non-commissioned employees too, to make sure that we're all mentally good to carry on.
Thank you so much. And we'll so I'm going to go through two questions that'll be quick, because I know we want to be able to wrap, but I want to go back to you for a second, Aaliyah, Detective, because, people talk often, and a lot of attention goes to the fact that, we all know that officers are men and women, and they represent many different racial, cultural communities, but people always focus and square in on Caucasian, non-Hispanic officers, white officers. And I wanted to have you speak to, what is it like to be an African American that is a sworn officer that's out in the field, and what does that look like? What are some of those conversations? What are some of the advantages? What are some of the challenges?
Well, I can immediately speak to the challenge of every time I'll just speak for myself, that every time I see videos or news reports about police officers using unnecessary force on Black people or other people of color, not abiding by the law or by their department policies is heartbreaking. And as a Black person, I've experienced, you know, feeling like I'm in a situation where people can call on me, and I might have to be prepared to explain myself to a police officer or security guard or what have you. So I completely relate to that, and I completely relate to the fear that people out in society experience, and you know, that anxiety. So I can completely relate to that. And then as a police officer, as a Black police officer, I have experienced things in uniform too that were discriminatory. So with all the protests that have been going on, I have done a self-assessment, seeing where I fit into all of this. And the thing that I always have focused on and will continue to focus on is making sure that as a minority and as a woman, making sure that I speak up in conversations about discrimination or unfair policing, and that I can offer a voice in the room that Caucasian officers can't, or you know, can't relate to or don't understand. So I have made a promise to myself to always speak up in those occasions, and speak up for community members who you know, may not be present or can't offer their voice to different things, ranging from policy to our discretion with enforcing the law or what have you.
Thank you so much. And I want to make sure that I pivot back, because I said that I wanted for Kevin and Natalie to give us some examples of some of those things that represent a de-escalation tactic.
I can provide an example from today. So I'm training somebody right now, and it's her first week. So today in training her, I saw a male who I know from the area. He has trouble finding a place to live, and we frequently offer him resources, and he doesn't want them. And he seemed to be in some mental distress today. He was kind of pacing, and he looked frustrated with his hands, and he was all alone, and he was kind of walking towards the front of the police department. So I thought, oh, maybe he's coming here to ask us for something. So I asked the officer I'm training, you know, go contact him and see if he needs something. And he informed us he wanted to be arrested, and he was really upset and demanded that it was his right to be arrested. And there was nothing to arrest him for. He didn't do anything wrong. And it was unclear what he wanted. You know, I wasn't sure if he wanted to go to jail. But of course, we can't just arrest somebody even though they want us to. He then began talking about things that really didn't make a lot of sense. And he became a little bit aggressive and punching a metal sign. And we were a little bit concerned he was going to hurt himself. So we continued to talk with him. We did put him into handcuffs and informed him he was not under arrest, but that we did that so that he would not continue to punch a metal sign and hurt himself or end up hurting somebody else, so that he could force, you know, us to have to arrest him. At that time, we had our MHP come out and assist us with speaking to him, and we were able to convince him to go to the hospital and get some help. At that time, he was still pretty upset, and he began to spit at us around him. And even though that was the case, he was still willing to go get help versus to have us let him walk away from there. So he was transported to the hospital and was open to resources. So I think that was an example of a situation that could have gone very differently if we did not take the time to talk with him, use our MHP to our ability, versus, you know, rushing in and maybe starting a confrontation with somebody who was in a crisis that was already clearly upset and did not seem to understand what he was really asking for.
I'll just say, I think there's a question that I have used that changes a subject's demeanor, just their personality when they're agitated. It just asking them, how can we help you? Or as an officer, how can I help you? And it just changes like their whole demeanor. And they're willing to speak with you and sometimes try to get help. Sometimes they'll just say, there's nothing you could do for me. So that's just kind of a question I've always used, and it seems to work. So.
Okay. Thank you. I'm going to go back to the chief for a minute, and I want to ask. So, let's go to combating bias and discrimination, whether it's implicit bias or unconscious bias. So, what are the ways that the Redmond Police Department is really trying to combat racism within the department?
So, combating racism and biases first and foremost starts with a conversation with the organization and with the members of the organization to have everybody understand. I think it's abundantly clear that we all have biases, but it's also important that we separate bias from prejudice, because those are not the same, and oftentimes those things get confused or get interchanged incorrectly. So the city has a program for all of its employees, of which the police department participated in, and that's the overcoming bias training. For myself, part of my background it is in training in that particular area. So right now, presently, I'm in the process of putting together a training cadre of staff here at the Redmond Police Department, specifically for the purpose of presenting procedural justice and implicit bias training for all police staff. And that will be something that will be coming on board in 2021. Hopefully by that time we'll be in like phase 3 of this COVID thing and can actually get together for training. But that will be one of the ways in which the department is going to address that particular subject. The other way is to look at our hiring practices and to make sure that they are equitable and that the organization actually represents the demographic of this particular community, both in gender and in ethnicity.
And I'll also jump in and say, because the other part of that question is, what kind of equity or implicit bias training do employees receive? And I can speak to that because I've partnered with the city of Redmond over the course of the last 2 years, and I personally delivered to every employee of the city of Redmond, along with the city council and city leaders, an unconscious bias, implicit bias training. And as a part of that experience, we talked about really, making sure that there was a level set across all city employees so that we could have uniformity or create a baseline in terms of language, concepts, and best practices, so that everyone was able to come to the table and have what are really emotionally and intellectually honest conversations about the state of the community and where we are today, the state of different departments across city government, and how we engage with people that come into Redmond, whether they live here, whether they work here, or they come here for recreation, because the goal is really to be consistent with the city's values of welcoming all people and making sure that we serve together as one Redmond. And so it's really exciting to know that along with the Community Equity Action Team, Diversity and Inclusion Training, and bias, anti-bias training, that these were all things that have been happening for a while now. And like was mentioned earlier, they weren't reactionary to any challenge, to any instance or situation that would have caused the city to respond because of a time of crisis. It was really during times that were really optimal, so that they were proactive instead of reactive. So it's exciting that that kind of thing happens. I want to also talk about I have a question for Sasha, actually. So what steps do dispatchers and officers take when somebody calls 911, for example, and says, I see someone and they look suspicious? How is that handled? Oh. What did you say? Oh, I'm sorry. So we answered that already. Okay, so then let's move to school resource officers. So why are school resource officers so important for students, and do they get any extra training? Kevin, can you answer that?
Yeah. So I would say the most important role as a school resource officer is building relationships with students, just bridging those gaps, those positive relationships with students. And I've been a school resource officer for the past 5 years at Rose Hill Middle School, and it's been an incredible experience for me, and I've got to know so many students and youth and their families. But that's the joy I get out of it, and I think it's important, and I think I have built a lot of positive relationships with students. Also, it's also important to know that not only am I there for disciplinary reasons or safety, I handle very few disciplinary situations. Most of that is handled by the school itself and by the admin of the school. So that's important to note. I'm there for education purposes as well. I teach several classes as far as classes in drugs and Fourth Amendment, search and seizure. One important class that I teach is now just social media. There's so much social media with the youth, and they're just getting into this social media, and that's their main communication between each other. So just knowing the laws related to social media is important for them. Also, I do a lot with families, getting to know families. A lot of parents have questions, so I'm talking to parents all the time. I'm talking with counselors who have questions, with students who may be talking to counselors and they have questions or want to run through some problems with me. So there's a lot. I'm just going to tell you what I do. I don't know. I can't speak for other school resource officers, but I'm involved with a lot of extracurricular activities after school. So these students see me, sometimes on weekends, sometimes after school at a concert, a band concert, music concert, a lot of the sports activities. So a lot of times they're seeing me outside with my uniform off, just as an everyday person, and so they get that aspect as well, and I think that's important.
And Shannon, I can speak. Oh, sorry.
Go ahead. No, go ahead.
There's a real important law, and I'm a parent of 2 elementary schoolers, and there's a really important House bill that passed last year that I think parents should know about. It's House Bill 1216. And I was trying to share the link. I'll try to find a way to get it out. But if you Google House Bill 1216 and OSPI, the superintendent's website, you'll find it. And it has some very specific 12 topic areas that all school resource officers in Washington State have to receive, in addition to being a commissioned and police officer in good standing. School resource officers are required to be trained in constitutional and civil rights of children in schools and in public, child and adolescent development, trauma-informed approaches, youth mental health issues, the educational rights of students with disabilities, the relationship of disability to behavior and best practices for interacting with students with disabilities, collateral consequences of arrest, referral, and court involvement. So understanding what an arrest can do to a child, resources in the community, local and national disparities in the use of force and arrests of children, de-escalation techniques specific to youth and groups of youth, state law on restraint and isolation in schools, bias-free policing, cultural competency, including best practices for students from different backgrounds, including language differences, LGBTQ students and immigrants, and then extensive training on FERPA, which is Federal Privacy Act. I would encourage you, if you have children in the school, to be familiar with that so you know what the SROs are getting extra training in above and beyond their traditional police training. So.
Thank you for that, Julie, because, I wanted to kind of pivot the conversation and talk about young people, because young people are becoming engaged. They've always been engaged, but even more than ever right now. And I think that social media is really driving, children to want to act, because, the times now really are different. And so Janet had a question along with her 13-year-old daughter who's here. And, she said that they'd recently talked about police officers, and she'd witnessed her mother call the police on a man suffering mental illness. And, she wants to know, she's unsure if you should call the police, if it's safe to call the police, even in that situation. So, what would you say to kids today who wonder, is it safe to call the police if someone's behaving oddly, or if it looks like they need help or in trouble? Is it still safe to call the police to come in to help in these situations? What do you say to kids?
Yeah,
and that could be for anyone.
Yeah, I would definitely say, call the police. And that's why we're kind of, Natalie mentioned it earlier, where we have this, MHP, a mental health professional, that's kind of working with us. So hopefully, she's there, or we could provide resources, and if she's available, that she could step in, and she has the knowledge to work with that individual. But definitely, to tell the youth, yes, call the police.
Definitely. I think that, a lot of people just look at us as a law enforcer, but we're so much more than that. And we do have access to a lot of different resources to provide. Several of those I can just name off the top of my head. Besides our MHP, we have our King County Mental Health Team, and they respond as well, or it can be available by phone if needed, but they can provide resources. They can provide a ride or food, water to somebody in need. Or I had a guy a couple weeks ago who had no socks and shoes, and they were able to bring him those. We also have a homeless outreach coordinator here. And these are all things that we can have either the person respond to the scene right then and there, or like I said, they can be hooked up with him on the phone. If not immediately, then they can get a call back pretty soon. Or if the person doesn't have a phone, then I can facilitate a meeting for them. So I do think it's important to call us. And I think, I know for us in Redmond, we have a lot to offer for somebody, if they're calling in for something that's not a crime, but somebody in distress, we are able to guide them in the right direction.
Thanks. And Aaliyah, do you have anything you want to add?
No, I agree with what Officers D'Amico and Kaptur both said. Even though our primary interest is to enforce the law, investigate crimes, we also are trained to recognize when we're dealing with people going through mental health crisis and trying to get them the help that they need. We recognize that arresting someone and taking them to jail is not always applicable and won't help that person overcome their crisis. So, whether we are grateful to have the assistance of a mental health professional when she's able to be there, but even if she's not there, we are capable of, whether it's calling for a mobile crisis or having an ambulance transport the person to a hospital. We are interested in getting them any type of help that will be beneficial to them.
Thank you so much. So every human has biases. And, when we talk about diversity is really all of the dimensions of difference that we hold as a human population. And, knowing that all of us have biases and opinions, whether they're racially based, culturally based, or otherwise, there's there's always a frustration when you have to deal with a challenging situation, and we're questioning. There's this internal dialogue that officers have as humans, and even the people that are in the public. But sometimes personal biases or experiences could cause an officer to think excessive force is necessary in some situations, because oftentimes, what you perceive to be real is what is real to you. So how can police training alongside tactical training, alongside implicit bias training, and you think of all of those things kind of coming together to ensure that police officers can apprehend or detain suspects with empathy? What does that look like, or how does that play out for officers? What is something that you feel like, because I want to make sure that people understand first and foremost that you wear a badge and you have a uniform and you go out to serve and offer your level best every day, whether it's the chief or dispatch or people in the field, officers or detectives. At the end of the day, you're humans that want to be able to go home and be safe and be back with your families. But knowing that you have to serve a diverse community and that we hope to be even more diverse department, when all of those different things kind of collide, how can the public be sure that the training and education and enablement is going to lead to empathetic service? So we'll go to Aaliyah and Julie and Kevin, and then also Natalie, Officer D'Amico.
Well, it's bringing all of the things that we already talked about together, from the expectation that we will hold each other accountable if we do witness misconduct, to intervene or report it, report it, to making sure that we all go through trainings on de-escalation, on implicit bias, even our legal update refreshers, by making sure that we are operating within our policy, within the law, doing what we are mandated to do, but also taking the classes like the implicit biases to understand our own thinking and our own emotional knowledge and capabilities, by knowing ourselves and also the standards that we're meant to uphold. That's how that's just the foundation to how we can operate humanely with people. But it also is part of that is cultural within our profession. Having senior officers check in on more junior officers and sharing our experiences on, hey, I found this helpful, when interacting with the public. And I know for me, one of the most impactful things that have lingered with my career was attending a basic interview and interrogation class held at my previous department. And it was by a detective who shared an experience about how he completely related to a suspect who was accused of actually murdering a police officer. And the murdered police officer was the detective's close friend. And the detective showed interview footage of him, overcoming an extreme bias of knowing the victim, being close with the victim, but also wanting to find out the truth about what happened. And he was the most calm and related to the suspect on the most human level, and was able to have the guy tell him everything that happened. And so whether it's racially or otherwise, we do all have biases to overcome. But if we could share those experiences with each other of how we overcome them, that is, it's lasted for me. And I hope that I could do that for newer officers.
Julie, how do we get from empathy to from aggression to empathy? Same question.
I don't know that I could say it any better than Detective Slade just did. I think what she's talking about and remembering, I've shared with some people before, we all have something that guides our work. And I guide my work in that everybody has a mom, right? You may have a different relationship with your mom. You may not know her. You may be close with her. But something that I've told myself on my calls for service, I've been an officer for 16 years and I'm from a police family, is that everybody has a mom. And if I can remember that, and I think about how that mom would want their child to be treated when I'm on the field contacting them, that gets me to empathy real fast. Even before I had children, I think that is, we all have a different path that we use, but that's one that was taught to me earlier in my career, and it has helped a lot. Everybody that I'm talking to has a story, has a worldview, has a life experience that's brought them to where they are in the contact with me. And if I keep that in my head, I will get to empathy really quickly. And when the chief talks about use of force, you can, it sounds odd, but I can even use my force with empathy because I'm trying to accomplish a lawful perspective as safely as possible to resolve everyone and keep everyone home, get everyone home at the end of the day safely. So that's, for me, the biggest thing I use to get to empathy. But I also want to pivot a little bit in this conversation and talk about the hiring practices. I know we have some questions on that, but when we talk about bias and background and how we police, we hire amazing people, and everyone will tell you that. I believe it. I've been here 16 years. I was a recruiter. I know Detective Slade has done background investigations. I have done background investigations. We don't just call your friends and ask how you are. We fly across the country to where you lived. We talk to your neighbors. I did communication specialist Leanne's background, so she knows. I drove to her house. I talked to her family. I talked to the friends she doesn't want me to know about. Every time I talk to someone, I say, who else have I not talked to? Because that is how I was trained here in this department. We do the standard psychological testing that's quite intense, the polygraph examination, the physical examination, the intellectual, making sure that you're a good fit and can write good police reports. But we spend a lot of money on background investigations because if you are living a life where your bias and your prejudice are informing your decisions and how you treat people, you don't make it in the door here. We will not even hire you. And if somehow you made it through the door, our training process is robust enough that we will kick you back out the door. Everybody has bias and prejudice, but how you are living those and treating people with those. And so we spend a lot of money and a lot of time on doing good hiring. And so I think that's one of the biggest things that we do is that we actively seek out people with varied life experience. We actively seek out people with customer service experience or military experience, people who have traveled, who interact with other people and understand what it means to treat people with respect and build real relationships. So I think that a typical background investigation is going to last a matter of weeks, not days, not hours. And so if you are hired by the Redmond Police Department, we have invested a lot of money in you and a lot of time. And we have unleashed an investigator to go learn everything about you to make sure that you are going to wear our patch well, because we take our patch very seriously and we're not going to put it on you unless we know you can represent us in a safe and ethical way. So.
Thank you. And I want to go to Officer Kaptur, to Kevin. How do you, long-time veteran serving with distinction and honor, now part of the Redmond Police Department. How do we get, same question, from aggression to empathy?
Me personally, I think it's treating all people with respect. Starting there, the people you contact. Citizens in the community, treat everyone with respect. And I think that's the start of it. And also, I think, as a field training officer in the program, and training new recruits who've been hired. Share, just getting them out and they see as officers, as senior officers, how we treat people in the community. I think it's a good background for them, a good foundation for them to learn, and so that they treat citizens the same way.
Thanks, Kevin. And then Officer D'Amico, same question. How do we get from aggression to empathy with people in the community?
Everyone has said some pretty amazing things so far, so I don't want to repeat anything that they've said. So I just want to talk about something a little bit different, but on the same topic. I think a lot of it has to do with being in tune with yourself as the officer as well. I know for me, when I was in detectives, I worked for 6 years, like sexual assault cases and crimes involving child victims. And I learned real fast how taxing that is, because of how you care as a human being so much about the victims and the fact that you can't change for them what happened. And I know going through that experience for those years that I reached a point where I felt I couldn't give them my all anymore, because I think I started to care too much. And I needed to be in tune with myself and figure out where I could be my best, not only for the people I was serving, but also for new officers coming in, because I wanted them to see how being empathetic isn't a weakness. For me, it's a strength, and I talk about it all the time at work. And I think the more we talk about it as officers and show our emotions sometimes, when appropriate, is important to show that we are human beings. We aren't robots. And so I think being vocal about it, talking about it to other officers, training other officers that way, and continuing to be that role model for them throughout the career is, for me, a very important feature in, cutting out aggression and having empathy.
And if I can jump in, kind of on a related note, one thing that helps me a lot with the kind of frustration that you mentioned of things that keep repeating, or just with the system in general, and something that I've tried to pass on to the people I've been training, is remembering that no matter what day you have had as a dispatcher, and this applies to our patrol and detectives as well, even if you have had all sorts of other, serious violence, terrible calls before, and now the next call you take is someone calling in because their car window got smashed and their laptop got stolen. Even if that's, routine and boring for you, that can still be the worst day of someone's life. And you are the first person that they're reaching out to about this event that, again, regardless of your own perspective, is traumatic, is important to them. And so remembering that helps me, keep from getting that kind of burnt out and irritated can happen sometimes, of, why are you calling about this thing that doesn't really matter? The answer is they're calling because it does matter, because no one should have to have any of these things happen to them, and we're here to help with all of it.
Thank you so much. And I want to go to the chief. Chief Lowe, you're the standard bearer for the department. You lead a department of incredibly talented men and women and non-binary individuals. So, but, at the start of your career, you were an officer just like these other officers, and you moved up the rank. And so I want to ask you as well, as the person that leads this department, how do we make sure that we go from a place of serving through the lens of aggression into getting to this place to serve with a lens of empathy?
Well, I think you heard it best from those on the front line doing it, but I'll go back to what I said when we started the conversation earlier. It starts at the top. right? And just as has been said, you treat everybody with dignity and respect, because at the end of the day, you're dealing with a human being. And if we start from there, we will get it, and we won't always get it right, and that's okay. But when we get it wrong, we have to own it. We have to own our mistakes, our shortcomings, and we as an organization, I as your chief am committed to making sure that when we get it wrong, that we will own it, that we will correct it, that we will get it right. But again, it starts with dignity and respect. And unfortunately, aggression is sometimes a part of this process, but it needs to be appropriate for the circumstance, and it shouldn't lead with aggression. And I think, as Sergeant Beard described it best, you can use aggression to achieve the outcome that you're looking for, and that's that everybody goes home safely at the end of that particular encounter. There's a lot of conversation around, the guardian warrior mindset, and I'll say I understand it, we get it, but again, it comes back to partnership with the community. Yes, we are guardians of the community, and yes, sometimes we have to go into warrior mode because of circumstances. But at the end of the day, we have to partner with our community because we're all in this together. It's not just the police; it's the police and the community that makes this such, a vibrant, thriving, dynamic community. As you say, that we live, work, play in, et cetera. So I think that's the important part, and as long as we don't forget that, we will continue to do it well, and we will continue to strive to improve and get better.
And let me ask you, Chief, you talked about partnering with the community, and community policing really is an all hands on deck effort. We depend on the community to be able to partner and support. And so if you could just, share with us, what can the public do to help? Because if we want to be able to serve in the best possible light and in the best possible capacity, what do you as the chief say to the community? What can they do in order to partner effectively so that they can become part of the change that we do all this together?
I would say, get involved, ask questions, come to the conversation, with an open mind, come to the conversation understanding that, you may not understand police procedure, police tactics, but if you want to know about it, just ask. We're here. We have a great, community engagement department. We have the SEAT program. We have our block captains program. We have our community academy. And that's probably the best way to get involved, because you get to come out over multiple weeks. You get to learn about every aspect of our police department. You get to interact, in person. Again, once we get beyond the COVID thing, with the great employees of the police department. So you get to see them not, from an enforcement perspective or out in the field. You get to see them in front of you as an audience, and get to explain and talk. You get to, talk to the chief, see the chief. But more importantly, you get to talk to the women and men that are out there, as they say, boots on the ground, doing this work day in and day out. So you get a better understanding. And it's like the Fabergé commercial, right? So the more people we can get in, and the more people that we can make ambassadors for the police department that can go out and set the record straight, because a lot of this conversation is driven by misinformation and confusion. Whereas if you know firsthand, because you went through a community academy, and I know we had either have or had some folks on from some of our neighboring communities, if you learn about your police department and how they do things, that is the best way for us as a partnership to work. Because when we understand what each other is about, it breaks down those barriers, and it takes away a lot of this confusion and misinformation that exists.
That's great. And so, we talked about, you mentioned the community academy. I'm disappointed that we're not going to be able to see you folks out for Redmond Derby days this year, but there are ride-alongs. I know the department does. I know that there is the neighborhood night out where officers go out and meet people in community. Let me pivot to Sergeant Beard, to Julie. So where can people find out where some of these things are? How can they connect with these resources, and how can they become more involved to be able to get a deeper knowledge or build a relationship with the Redmond Police Department?
Oh, Let me say, call me, but it's not always that easy. But please call me. You have every right and ability to talk to your police department. We only have legitimacy if we work in partnership with the public. That is how policing works in America. And so I encourage you strongly to get involved with your police department, listen to what our chief is saying. But I also understand that it's not easy to call and talk to someone in uniform sometimes. You may be coming from prior trauma, generational experiences, personal experiences that make it real uncomfortable to talk to someone who's dressed like I am. So what I would ask is, if you are comfortable emailing, calling, following us on any of our social media channels, Twitter, Instagram, we have a blog. We have videos we put out on our website. If you are comfortable with those mediums, those are great. Those are monitored by my team. You can email us at rpd or police@redmond.gov. You can call and ask to talk to any one of us. But if you're not comfortable with that for whatever reason, I'd also encourage you to look at the members of our SEAT team, our Community Equity Action Team. And if you are have someone in your community who's a member of SEAT, a lot of them have offered to be a conduit to our police department so that you can ask questions through them, or you can share with them and they can bring it forward to us. And I'm also always willing. I do wear my uniform, and I always wear my uniform. It is part of my profession, so I can go on 911 calls. But I will meet you off-site too. And I know many of our staff and members of my team will come meet you off-site if you're not comfortable being in the police department. So part of my mission is to make sure that you, as a member of our community, however you define that, you live here, you work here, you commute through here, you go to school here, you can relate and find a way to engage with us that works for you. So it's kind of a broader answer, but call me is the simple answer, I guess.
Okay. Thank you so much. And then I want to go back to the chief because, people ask often, we want to partner with the department. We want to know what the policies are. We want to know what the governance structure is. And, at the end of the day, they want officers to be accountable to the community and to the people that are being served. And, one of the burning questions that people have is, do Redmond police officers wear body cameras? And is there a plan to require them?
So presently, we do not wear body-worn cameras. About a month ago now, I did a presentation to City Council related to a body-worn camera program here for the Redmond Police Department. And right now we don't, because it is a financial strain. Just by way of example, in order for us to implement a body-worn camera program here, it would cost about $466,000 for essentially a 5-year implementation of body-worn cameras. And while body-worn cameras are, I'll say, a nice tool, an effective tool to have because it provides another perspective to circumstances and situations, we have a police department here that is not increased in staffing in over 10 years. We have a light rail system going operational here in Redmond, down in Overlake in about 18 months. So if I had to make the choice as your police chief between an expenditure on body-worn cameras and an expenditure for additional staffing, I'm going to take the additional staffing because the folks out there doing the work incredibly hard, and they do a phenomenal job at keeping this community safe. It's my job to make sure I keep them safe and to make sure that they have the support and staffing that they need in order to continue doing that work. So we don't have them, and the reason why right now is financial. I'm not opposed to body-worn cameras. I've talked to many members of our patrol staff. They would welcome body-worn cameras, but it just comes down to the economics of it, and then the allocation of those limited resources if they were to become available.
And then, just finally, for the chief, any parting words? Because, we've talked about partnering with the community. We've talked about unconscious bias. We've talked about de-escalation. We've talked about use of force, holding officers accountable, modeling positive behaviors. How do we end the conversation? So you are, Chief Darryl Lowe. You are the chief of the Redmond Police Department. What parting message do you want to leave with the community today?
Again, I just want to thank everybody for taking the time to be part of this conversation and or to listen to the conversation. I want to thank my staff that joined me tonight. Thank you guys for sharing your experiences with the community so that they hear it from you. Oftentimes as a chief, I'm in front of a lot of these different meetings, but I think it's critically important that they hear from the men and women that are actually out there doing the job. And then I'll kind of repeat what I said before. Let's continue to have the conversation, even the difficult conversation. And I'm going to steal, one of your phrases. It goes back to, eggs are not just for breakfast, right? We can look at things from a lot of different perspectives, but communication is the key. Most of the time when there's a misunderstanding, it's because of assumption, it could be biases, but oftentimes it comes down to a lack of understanding and a lack of communication. So I would just ask the community, please continue to engage with us in this communication as we move forward. Again, we are committed to being the best police department possible, and we are open and want to hear from you, the community, as to how we can better partner with you as we go through this journey together.
Thank you so much, Chief. And I wanted to thank all of the officers and detectives that joined us tonight, members of the support staff, IT, and everyone. And just thank everybody for joining us on the call and participating in really what is a courageous conversation. What is, an opportunity to talk about, some of the challenges that our department has faced and will continue to work to grow and improve ways that we can partner with the community, because the point of it all is that we have a strong and robust department that is able to serve successfully in partnership with the community, because to be one Redmond, we have to be able to do all of this together. So thank you so much for your time and your attention today. And please, everyone, make sure that you practice social distancing, wear your masks, and let's be safe together.